Now we will I'll let Enda get his slides going while I introduce him. Dr. Enda Murphy is a coastal engineer and an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of British Columbia. Enda has almost 2 decades of applied research and consultancy experience involving the application of numerical and physical modeling techniques to address coastal and estuarine management challenges. His research and teaching interests are towards an improved understanding and more sustainable management of coastal hazard risk through transdisciplinary whole system approaches and innovative nature-based solutions. And Enda was chief editor of nature-based infrastructure for coastal flood and erosion risk management design guide that was a cross Canada design guide. So Enda is a real leader in nature-based solutions, and we're lucky to have him back in BC, where he can help reinvigorate the next generation of coastal engineering here. So I will turn it over to Enda.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction. And I did flag to Sarah that, in fact, I had the pleasure of presenting at the AGM several years ago. So hopefully there's not fatigue in listening to me. But a lot has changed since then. As Sarah mentioned, I'm back in BC now, which I'm delighted to be, and working at University of British Columbia for the past year. And so I'm going to today hopefully present some new material to show some of the work that we've been doing in the last year that is relevant to nature-based solutions. Before I do, I just want to acknowledge, as a coastal engineer, it's really important that we acknowledge the traditional lands and territories in which we work. I'm coming to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who've played a really important role in stewarding the coastal zone in this part of the world since time immemorial, and are continuing to do so today. The focus of my research and my group's research, which I've called the team, the Coastal Systems Engineering Lab, because we strive to apply whole system thinking to everything that we do. And our focus is really on 3 things, really. Understanding coastal hazard risk through the application of and development of improved multi-scale systems models, using those models to develop and test innovative nature-based solutions to manage risk in our coastal zones. And then I truly believe that the best way to achieve all of this is by establishing sustained living labs where we can bring together people with different perspectives, worldviews, knowledge systems and skills, and apply a whole range of research activities to develop a really comprehensive understanding of these systems going forward, including things like long-term monitoring. I will say just the context. I think that we have made a lot of advances in coastal risk assessment and management practice in Canada in the last decade or so. We've had a proliferation now of guidance, National Standards of Canada, on how to conduct flood hazard and risk assessments on the coast. And we've had the emergence of a whole suite of guidelines and guidance on implementation of nature-based solutions, including some of the great work that's come out of SCBC, as well as some of the work that I've been involved in at the National Research Council before coming to UBC. And so I've just shown as the last item there the guide that we published last year, and that's freely available for anyone to access, should they so wish. We've also got thriving communities of practice now centered on nature-based solutions in Canada. So for anyone who's not a member of the Pacific chapter of the Nature-Based Coastal Solutions Community of Practice, please do sign up. It's a great opportunity to access regular webinars and in-person gatherings to discuss nature-based solutions from a variety of perspectives. So we're making some of this progress, but we're still seeing escalating coastal hazard risk in Canada, and we're really, haven't felt the full effects of things like sea level rise yet. So what's going wrong? Well, my opinion, one of those issues relates to our awareness of risk. And so we now have lots of guidance for assessing coastal flood and erosion risk, for example. But risk assessments are expensive, data-intensive exercises, challenging, particularly for small communities with limited resources to implement. And the uptick of that is that we have limited capacity for stewardship of these types of assessments and limited access to maps. Even someone buying a property very often will find it very difficult to find maps demonstrating what sort of risks they might be exposed to. So the consequences are this low public awareness of risk and decisions of regret or perhaps decision paralysis. So one of the things that I'm working on, glad to be part of an initiative led by the University of Calgary that hopes to address some of these challenges with access to flood risk information, is the Open Frank project, so an open source flood risk analysis network for Canada. And this is really striving to develop open source, open access tools and maps of flood hazard at a national scale across Canada, starting with putting in place the building blocks or frameworks for an open access system that can be contributed to by a whole range of actors and stakeholders and rights holders. And the goal here is really to develop scalable, reproducible workflows. So as part of the coastal flooding work package that I'm a part of on this project, one of the things we're doing is seeing how we can develop scalable modeling approaches. So these are models that can be applied eventually at a national scale to understand flood risk. And that's a real challenge because it means making some compromises in terms of the level of physics that we incorporate. So we're tackling this by testing a number of large regional areas at my lab, looking at the Fraser estuary and contributing river watersheds. And so we're applying these reduced complexity approaches and benchmarking them against more complex models to see how they perform, ultimately to decide, how good is good enough when it comes to model fidelity and accuracy. And in order to validate these models, we need distributed networks of monitoring systems. And so we're working on low-cost monitoring techniques using things like simple trail cams and leveraging AI technology to develop inputs to these models to validate and calibrate them. And the goal here, of course, is eventually to make all of this data open access. So moving from understanding risk to developing solutions, and in this case, I'm actually moving outside BC. This is to Tuktoyaktuk in the Northwest Territories on the Beaufort Sea coast. This is a low-lying Inuvialuit community that's faced immense challenges in terms of sea level rise and erosion. And one of the things that's a real concern to them is the large quantities of driftwood and debris in the coastal zone that comes down the Mackenzie River every year. And so there's concern that with retreating sea ice and increasing exposure to large waves and extreme storm surges, that these large quantities of driftwood that exist in some of the lagoons and bays around Tuktoyaktuk will become mobilized and impact on community buildings, infrastructure, valued assets, and navigational waterways. And so one of the things we want to understand is, well, can we turn this challenge into an opportunity and find ways to understand how we might be able to integrate some of this material in some of the coastal hazard risk management solutions that are being developed for the community. And so in order to do that, we need to understand how driftwood moves in the system, particularly when mobilized by storms. And so this past summer, I spent 2 weeks up at Tuck with a graduate student, Isaac Gould, conducting a variety of field experiments, some involving these low-cost drifters that basically simulate the behavior of driftwood. And so these are essentially Nalgene bottles with $20 Arduino Nano units, battery-powered units inside them. We dump these in the shoreline and then we retrieve them and see how they've moved under different wave and water current conditions. And of course, we can use this data to calibrate and validate models of driftwood movement to understand mobility of driftwood in the coastal zone. And we're also using things like low-cost binocular vision camera installations, as you see in the bottom left. So these are basically security cameras that you can buy in any hardware store, and using them in a sort of binocular vision setup to extract important information about waves, currents, and water levels from what they see. And we're also doing experiments with real logs, this time applying a little bit more expensive technology. So this is an Iridium solar GPS unit that's been tagged to a log, and we hope to deploy west of Tuktoyaktuk and retrieve it during the 2 weeks that we were there. Unfortunately, we picked the worst possible day to do that when we had a strong offshore wind, and I watched my expensive equipment sailing off to the limit of sea ice before eventually getting transported about 50 kilometers east of Tuk and beaching on a barrier island system there. But that's actually still great, transmitting great data. We saw it mobilized by 2 extreme storm surge events that have been up at Tuk in the last couple of months. And so that's going to be really useful data to us as we work towards our goal to develop these models and systems. And even the more rudimentary field techniques we apply to actually measure, observe, test the roughness of different driftwood pieces is going to be really valuable as we work to develop these conceptual models and more sophisticated numerical models. And why do we want to do that? Well, how can we test nature-based solutions incorporating some of this native local material? And so one of the hypotheses is that we could mimic some natural analogs that we see on barrier beach systems in the region. So where we have large quantities of driftwood embedded in sand, providing the joint benefits of both the sediment and the driftwood matrices. So can we actually construct these wood sediment matrices to provide stability and protection to the shoreline? And while we're doing that, perhaps these solutions are in fact better than conventional rock armoring, for example, in increasing albedo, so limiting the effects of solar radiation on thawing of permafrost that's also destabilizing these shorelines. So, of course, we'd also like to take what we learned from these experiments, field experiments, back home. And so I've got another graduate student starting this September on applying similar types of techniques to the shoreline in Burrard Inlet, where driftwood poses issues on a yearly basis. So working with collaborators at DHI and the Vancouver Parks Board to understand potential impacts on the shoreline from driftwood and being able to develop solutions. But before I leave Tuktoyaktuk completely, I just wanted to really make a shout out to the hamlet of Tuk, the Geological Survey of Canada and Northumbria University, who've been working over many years to establish really strong protocols for community-led science. And so starting with making sure that all grant funding provides salary for a community science liaison officer, who you see here in the bottom left image. So that's Diva Lynn, who here is applying iPhone LiDAR to survey a beach nourishment that was recently constructed at Tuk. And she's now in the process of training a number of high school students to conduct these citizen science surveys and compare them to some of the more technologically advanced surveys that we have, so that we can see whether this technique might be a way for the community to take ownership of understanding change on their shoreline. Lastly, I'm going to touch back close to home on work at Sturgeon Bank. So many of you know this location, complex intertidal mudflat and marsh system to the west of Richmond with receding salt marshes. Pilot project led by Ducks Unlimited Canada and Northwest Hydraulics to place sediment in mounds on the foreshore and allow natural processes to nourish those marsh systems. But after 3 years of placement, we still have limited understanding of the success or otherwise of this work. So I've been working with graduate students to deploy sensors on the mudflats, monitor waves, currents, turbidity, and use that to support the development of high-resolution numerical models that can then show us some of the complex patterns that emerge and that may influence the success of nature-based solutions projects like this. For example, the net seaward transport through the complex networks of drainage channels that exist on these marsh systems that might influence where you might want to place sediment, particularly fine sediment that can be transported through these networks. By contrast, perhaps coarser grain sediments can migrate shoreward, as we've seen based on an undergraduate student's analysis of oblique aerial imagery over the past year of a sand island that was constructed at Stevenston North Jetty back in the 80s. So ultimately, we want to move from both understanding at these local scales to system-wide scales. And so starting with another graduate student to develop now larger scale morphodynamic models that will feed into the development of the SEEDS initiative being led by UBC Coastal Adaptation Lab and Ducks Unlimited Canada. So to wrap up, so we're making some progress towards understanding and sustainably managing coastal flood and erosion risk. Some barriers remain, particularly in terms of access to models, data, and technical expertise. We need to have better process understanding at both site-specific and system-wide scales. And that, I think, is going to require a commitment to collaboration, openness, data sharing, and dissemination. So just a shout out to my students, some of whose research topics are listed here, but in the interest of time, I will wrap it up. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Enda. We did have one question in the chat about driftwood. It was a question from Austin about impacts of driftwood degrading a dike seaward face through mechanical motion. I don't know if you can see it there in the chat, but that was a question from Austin. He says there's one project he's working on where the worry is that the driftwood will damage the vegetation in the dike structure, although it may help sedimentation for the better in other ways.
Yeah, and I think it's this balancing act, right? We definitely know that cut cylindrical logs from forestry industry behave very differently to natural wood in the system that has roughness and can become embedded in structures and infrastructure. So that's something, yeah, we're working on understanding some of those driftwood shore interaction dynamics and how we can better understand and manage driftwood in the coastal zone. But it's a complex challenge.
Great. Thank you, Enda. And thank you also for highlighting the community-based monitoring that is happening with your project. And hopefully we'll be successful in getting some additional funding to scale up some community-based monitoring for Green Shores projects as well. So stay tuned for that.